How are you guys doing? Today is Friday, May 6th, 2022. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an elite individual profile on Cameron Heyward. The elite defensive tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers out of Pittsburgh is turning 33 today, and what I plan on doing with this episode is I plan on doing an in-depth look at how Cameron Heyward has been impacting the league, of course from a micro level, game in, game out, season in, season out, from a statistical level, and I'm going to look at how he's been able to impact the game on a macro level and look at how his impact overall has helped the Steelers and has helped football, of course, advance forward. If you're not familiar with Cameron Heyward, he's about 6'5", 295 pounds. He's just a giant block of muscle and size. And the thing about it is, at least with everything, most defensive tackles are roughly his size. But I think the difference with Cameron Heyward is I think he has a lot more athleticism within his first step. He has a lot more athleticism than a lot of people give him credit for. He's incredibly strong, and I think the fact that he's been so battle-tested, he's played literally almost every game that he's played with the Steelers on that defensive line, and I do think that he's one of those players where just eventually the experience caught up with him, and now he's a player that sees things before it happens. As a defensive tackle, I think that's very valuable, and I think the Steelers have found that valuable as well. So, getting into his story, he was originally born in Pittsburgh. He would go on to play high school football in Georgia, though. He would go on to get recruited to play college football, at Ohio State, and he would go on to play at Ohio State all the way back when Jim Tressel was the coach, two coaches before Urban Meyer. Cameron Heyward's first season in college would be his freshman season in 2007. As a freshman, Cameron Heyward would go on to start for Ohio State as they went all the way to the BCS National Championship. He would go on to, in the 13 games he played, he finished with 33 tackles. As a freshman, he had 10 tackles for loss. As a freshman, he had 2.5 sacks, a forced fumble, and he even defended a couple of passes, all as a freshman. Following his 2007 season, he was actually named a consensus All-American as a freshman. Ohio State would then go on to the national championship where they would lose to the LSU Tigers by 2 touchdowns. But after that first season, people started to get a sense of who Cameron Heyward was. Following that very first season, he would go on to return to Ohio State for his sophomore season. In his sophomore season, he would go on to play all 13 games yet again, as Ohio State would have a very good year. They would go 10-3, going all the way to the Fiesta Bowl, where they would lose yet another bowl game. They lost this one to the Texas Longhorns. They lost by about 3 in this matchup. Cameron Heyward would go on to finish with 36 tackles in that season, 3 more than his freshman season. He would finish with 3 sacks, a forced fumble as well. And with this season coming to an end, Cameron Heyward would have to use his third year of eligibility and return to Ohio State for his junior season in 2009. And in his 2009 season, which would go down as his age 20 season, he would go on to start all 13 games he played in a season where Ohio State would end up going 11-2. This time they ended up going to the Rose Bowl where they would beat Oregon, as in that Rose Bowl game, or I guess within that season, he had 46 total tackles on the year, 10 more than his sophomore year. He had 10 tackles for loss, on par with what he did as a freshman. He would go on to, he would have 6 sacks on the year, as he did go on to finish with a fumble recovery touchdown on the year. Following that 2009 season, he would, and they would go on to beat Oregon. He would decide against declaring for the draft, and he would return for his senior season. And his senior season at Ohio State would go on to be his age 21 season in 2010. In that season, he would start all 13 games, making it that he played 52 college games, but 13 games in a season where Ohio State would go on to, they would end up going 12-1. This was the year that I imagine their wins would get taken away. I forget exactly why. But following this season, Cameron Heyward would go on to finish with 48 tackles on the year, the most he would put together in any of his years at Ohio State. He had 13 tackles for loss, also a career high for him. He would go on to record an 80-yard interception, even though it wasn't a touchdown. His lone interception of college is he had 3.5 sacks. Following that 2010 season, he was named to the first team All-Big Ten, and after his 4 years at Ohio State and putting together a good combine, he would be taken with the second to last pick of the first round of the 2011 draft. As looking at defensive ends in this draft, the first defensive end taken would be J.J. Watt, who would go on to win a couple of Defensive Player of the Years. After him, Robert Quinn would be taken with the 14th pick by the Rams. Ryan Kerrigan was taken by the Redskins, 16th overall. And looking at where Cameron Heyward fits in, he was about the 5th or 6th or 7th defensive end that was taken in this highly prestigious draft. And of course, just for context, Cam Newton was number 1. This is when Von Miller went number 2. Julio Jones went number 6. And this was a very star-studded draft that Cameron Heyward would come out of. And he, of course, would be a very big part of defining that 2011 draft. He was taken by the Pittsburgh Steelers, where, of course, he's been a member. He's been a solid, consistent piece on that defensive line for at least a decade. His first season of his 11-year tenure with the Pittsburgh Steelers would start in his age 22 season in 2011. As a rookie, he would not start a single game, but he did play all 16 games in a season where the Steelers would finish with a 12-4 record. This would be a year where they finished second in their division, the AFC North. In 2011, Cameron Heyward would finish with 11 tackles in those 16 games, as he would finish with a forced fumble and even a sack on the year, kind of doing what he needed to do as that role player. It was really tough it took a second for him to get noticed. Even going into the next year, he wouldn't be named the full starter after his first year. But following that first season, the Pittsburgh Steelers would end up going to the playoffs, so they would end up losing the very first game of that playoffs. They lost in the wild card round to the Denver Broncos. If you're not familiar with that play, that was the year where Tim Tebow threw a slant and Demaryius Thomas basically ended the Pittsburgh Steelers on one play in overtime. So that was the very first time that Cameron Heyward would go on to make the playoffs. His second season with the Pittsburgh Steelers would be his age 23 season in 2012. This season he was not starting either. He didn't start a single game, but he played 16 games in a season where the Steelers would finish with an 8-8 record. This was, of course, their 6th season under Mike Tomlin, and even though they went 8-8, this would still be yet another season under Mike Tomlin's career in which he did not have a losing record. In Heyward's second year, he would go on to finish with 20 tackles, more than what he had before, and even at a sack and a half. All of this as the Steelers would go on to miss the playoffs. Following the season, Cameron Heyward would go on to earn his way into the starting lineup in his third season, as he would start 13 of the 16 games he played for a Pittsburgh Steelers side that would go on and finish with an 8-8 record for the second year in a row in 2013. In his first season as a starter, Cam Heyward would see his tackles jump up from 20 to 59. His tackles for loss went up from 4 to 7. He would go on to record a fumble recovery as well, and he would go on to finish with 5 sacks as a defensive end. And once this season came to an end, the Steelers, like I said, would miss the playoffs, but Cameron Heyward would start to be recognized as at least a starter in his own team. His first full season of being a starter was his 4th season with the team in his age 25 season, and in 2014, he started all 16 of the games he played in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would go 11-5. They would go on to win the AFC North for the first time since the year before they drafted him. And in that 2014 season, Cameron Heyward, as a starter, would record 53 tackles, about 6 less than he had the year before. He would go on to record 11 tackles for loss, the first time he had double digits in that category. And he would go on to finish with 7.5 sacks, 2.5 more than the year before. Even though he wasn't an all-star, he was a very big part of the reason why the Steelers were pretty good that year. Once they made it to the playoffs, they would end up losing by 13 in the wild card to their division rivals, the the Baltimore Ravens, as this was the year in which the Patriots would beat the Seahawks in the Super Bowl. But of course, transitioning into Cameron Heyward's 5th season with the team, his age 26 season in 2015, he would start all 16 of the games he played for the second year in a row. And this was all in a season where the Steelers would go 10-6. They finished with the second best record in the AFC North, but still made the playoffs anyway. In Cameron Heyward's second playoff season, he would finish with 54 tackles, as much as he had the year before. He had 15 tackles for loss, as that would be the most tackles for loss he would put together in a season up until that point. Second year in a row, he had double digits. He would go on to finish with a forced fumble, his second in his career, and he would finish with 7 sacks. This would be the third year in a row he had at least 5 while trying to fight for that starting defensive end position. Once the Steelers ended up making the playoffs in 2015, they ended up beating the Bengals in the wild card round just so they could lose to the Broncos in the divisional round. This is the year where the Broncos would go on to beat the Panthers in the Super Bowl. That was when Peyton Manning went on to win his second, that's when Peyton Manning won his second Super Bowl. But following that season, that would lead into Cameron Heyward's 6th season with the team. In 2016, he would only start 7 games. And of course, this was a year in which he would tear his pectoral muscle against the Cowboys. This is the first season that he didn't play like every single game. And even the next year, he only missed 1. But in the 7-game season he played, he would finish with 21 tackles. He also had 3 sacks on the year, a fumble recovery, and he would even have 4 tackles for loss as he did what he could. Following that season, the Pittsburgh Steelers would go on to win the AFC North with an 11-5 record. They would beat the Dolphins in the wild card round. They would beat the Chiefs in the divisional playoff round before eventually losing to the Patriots by 19 in the AFC Championship. The Patriots would go on and beat the Falcons in overtime in the Super Bowl this year, as that is how that year would end up going. Following Cameron Heyward's 7th year in the league that was plagued by injury, he would come back for his 8th season in football with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and this is the season where everything changed once he came back off of his injury. In his 7th season in the league, he will go on to start all 15 of the games he played in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers had a 13-3 record. They would go on to win the AFC North that season. And in that season, Cameron Heyward would go on to be named to he was named to the Pro Bowl, and he was named to the AP First Team All-Pro for the very first time in his career after having not made a Pro Bowl at all before then. In that season, he had 45 tackles, as this would be one of his last seasons playing full-on defensive end. He would still go on to finish with 16 tackles for loss, which is his career high. He would finish with 12 sacks, the first time he would ever record a double-digit amount of sacks, and his 12 sacks in 2017 are also a career high. He would go on to force a couple of fumbles and even recover one. And once this season would come to an end, after he was named to the Pro Bowl and to the First Team All-Pro, he was voted 4th in the AP Comeback Player of the Year voting, as the Comeback Player of the Year was Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. Once the Steelers would make it into the playoffs, they would end up losing in the divisional round to the Jaguars. They lost by 3. This is the year in which the Philadelphia Eagles ended up beating the Patriots in the Super Bowl. However, this would transition into Heyward's 8th season with the team in his age 29 season in 2018. He would start all 16 games in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would end up going 9-6-1. They would miss the playoffs after making it for 4 straight years. But in that season, Cameron Heyward would go on to be named a Pro Bowler for the second year in a row. He had 51 tackles in those 16 games as he was officially moved to defensive tackle. And alongside those 51 tackles, which are the third most he put together in a season by that point, he would finish with 10 tackles for loss, making it the 4th time in a 10-year stretch he had at least a double-digit amount of tackles for loss. He would also go on to force a fumble and then recover a fumble as well. And once this season came to an end, he would go on to return to Pittsburgh for his 9th season with the team. In his age 30 season, he would go on to start all 16 of the games he played in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers would end up going 8-8. They won 1 less game than the previous year. In that 2019 season, Heyward would finish with 83 tackles on the year, the first time he eclipsed 80, the first time he had more than 60 in a season as well. And in his last season, as he moved back to defensive end, he would record 11 tackles for loss. This would be the 5th year in a 6-year stretch that he had a double-digit amount of those. He would go on to finish with a forced fumble, a fumble recovery, as well as he also had 9 sacks. At that point, his 9 sacks were the second most he put together in his career. He would be named to the Pro Bowl for the 3rd year in a row, and he would be named to the first-team All-Pro in the NFL for the second time in his career. Once the Steelers season came to an end, this would, of course, lead Cameron Heyward to coming back and being named a Pro Bowler for the 4th year in a row in 2020. 2020 didn't see anything happen to the length of the schedule itself, but it did see that there were virtually no fans for the entire season. In his age 31 season, in his 10th season with the Steelers, Cameron Heyward would start all 15 of the games he played in a season where the Pittsburgh Steelers had a 12-4 record. They would win the AFC North with that record, and as they had 4 more wins in the prior year. Cameron Heyward would go on to finish with 54 tackles on the year. This would be pretty much on par with what he was doing at that point. He would finish with 7 tackles for loss. He would go on to have 4 sacks, and he would defend 3 passes, as he was definitely moved to defensive tackle for this season. He would be named to the Pro Bowl for the 4th year in a row. He was named to the second-team All-Pro for the only time that he's been named to the second team in his career. This is the 3rd year in a 4-year stretch he made an AP NFL team. And following the regular season, the Steelers would go into the playoffs, where they would lose in the wild card round to the Cleveland Browns from their own division. This year would end up seeing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers winning the Super Bowl in their home stadium. And last but not least, this would transition into this most recent season that Cameron Heyward has played, his age 32 season for this Pittsburgh Steelers side. In the first season in which the NFL has expanded the schedule to 17 games for all teams, Cameron Heyward would start all 17 of the games he played with a Pittsburgh Steelers team that went 9-7-1. They had 3 less wins than the prior year. And last year was also the year where TJ Watt was named the Defensive Player of the Year in the league. Cameron Heyward would be named to the All-Star for the He would be named to the Pro Bowl for the 5th year in a row. He would go on to record 89 tackles this last season as a defensive tackle, the most that he's been ever to put together in a season. He had 15 tackles for loss. That would, of course, make it so that 6 of the last 8 years he's had at least 10 tackles for loss in the season. He would finish with 10 sacks. That's the second time in his career he's had a double-digit amount of sacks. His career high is 12. And then he would go on to record an interception for the 2nd year in a row. Not to mention that he would go on to force and recover a fumble as well. In addition to being named a Pro Bowl for the 5th year in a row, Cameron Heyward was named to the first-team All-Pro for the 3rd time in a 5-year stretch just this past season. And that is currently where we sit as we are in the NFL offseason right now. We are about a few months away from the beginning of this NFL season. But when we do get there, Cameron Heyward is going to enter the season having made the last 5 Pro Bowls and having made 3 of the last 5 first-team All-Pros. So it'll be a while. I'm going to have to see Cameron Heyward not compete at that level for me to be fully convinced that he's not of that level. Because Cameron Heyward has shown that, at least through all of his hard work and his experience, he is definitely taking advantage of his experience, and he's taking advantage of this time in his life. I do think, as he is turning 33 today, I do think that he has a very impressive and amazing career that he should be proud of, especially having been born in Pittsburgh. With that said, I do want to thank everyone that's been listening to all 19 minutes of this piece. I do hope all is well. I want to thank the college and pro football references for giving me all the facts and figures. I want to, of course, I want to thank a lot of sources for helping me get to this. And with that said, once all of today's exhibitions and matchups are done, I'm going to come back tomorrow on May 7th for another episode. And hopefully by this time next year, I'll have another profile of Cameron Heyward. And if not, I still have the opportunity to, of course, explain why Cameron Heyward is at least loved and respected the way he is as a football player, considering we're talking about defensive tackles. Thanks for listening to this piece. I hope all is well. And I do have another profile after this. Thanks for listening. I hope all is well. I'll catch you with another piece tomorrow. Peace out.